Hello, this is Thelma English. Welcome back to a survey of American literature. We are at session 10. Let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we are so grateful that we can come together and study American literature and study from those earliest Americans who put pen to paper and recorded things so that we could be blessed hundreds of years later. May we understand our culture better after our lesson today. And Father, may you be glorified in all that we do and learn in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, we have a fun class today. We only have 83 slides, and so you do have some time to play our little game. You don't have to worry about that. This is time to pause the video and have your volunteer read A Valley of Vision. Go ahead and pause. Thank you. Okay. Before you leave today, make sure you get another volunteer. Somebody should just put their hand in the air right now and volunteer to read next week. If you are sitting alone in your bedroom doing this class by yourself on your laptop, or heaven help you if you're trying to watch on your phone, then don't skip the devotion. You simply read every week to yourself. All right, that's my good advice. Session 10, schedule review. We're going to continue talking about our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution from about 11 years later. We are going to play a constitutional game called the Preamble Scramble. Hopefully you actually read your Constitution last week, and then we'll be talking about the founding documents today. Don't ever skip syllabus reading, and don't think the Constitution is boring and not worthy of your time to read. If you didn't actually read it last week, will you please commit to yourself now that you will read it this week? Most Americans have not read their Constitution. Most Americans do not understand how decisions are made and do not understand, for example, the first 5 amendments or the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, or how important the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments are, or how important the 14th Amendment is, or how important it is that we finally had amendments for women to vote, things like that. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I expect you to read your Constitution. All right, we're going to be reading from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow from our 101 American Poems. By now you have realized that you should just bring that to class every week with you in case you see something you like so that you can mark it. And you'll be reading about American poets in your syllabus. It looks like about 13 pages this week about different American poets. Never skip your syllabus reading. This is valuable information. Your writing, you have one more week to work on your Declaration or Constitution history paper that is due now next session. For some of you, this falls over the Thanksgiving week, so you may actually have 2 weeks if you skip Thanksgiving week like I always did. But this is session 10 and your paper is due session 11, whether that is in 1 week or 2 weeks. You have some cool optional online to listen to. What's Right with America, Why America is Great, Why American History Texts Are Unreliable, and the answer to that optional online audio is that they are not first person. We like to read original sources in this class. So if we want to learn about William Bradford, we read William Bradford's words. If we want to know about Mary Rowlandson, we read what Mary Rowlandson wrote. If we want to know about Anne Bradstreet, then we read Anne Bradstreet's poetry. If we want to know who Richard Baxter was, then we read Richard Baxter. And then we take the best and we make that our own. All right, moving forward. The Preamble Scramble. Okay, this is the Preamble Scramble, and this is the scrambled preamble. You can see that it's multiple colors and it's all scrambled up. Your teacher or parent, or you yourself, if you had to do it, are supposed to cut this into strips according to color. So all of the, I believe on paper, it will look less chunky. The words are quite large on this PowerPoint screen. And so on a piece of paper, they will actually be strips. The Constitution for the United States of America would be all one strip, I believe, on your copy. And you cut this into strips according to colors, and then you divide into teams. Or if you are all by yourself, then you have to do it by yourself, and you have to check yourself and correct yourself. But that's okay. It's worth it. And so to play the game, you print the Preamble Scramble in color ink. It has to be color. You cut it into word groups by color. You divide the class into teams, or if there are only two of you, you could time yourself and see who finishes first. Or if you're alone, you could just time yourself. Each team gets a set of the word strips, and now go assemble the preamble. So pause here and assemble your preamble. All right, we're back. I would guess that that could have taken 15 minutes or so for somebody to finally get it correct and then to correct it yourself, because many of these are clauses with commas, and so they could have been in any type of order. But if you read it through even 5 or 6 times last week, I believe that you could assemble the preamble correctly. If you really need to let me know how great you did, you know, you can send me an email. You know, I am Thelma English, and you know that my email is thelma.lito @gmail.com. And I'll get it and you can tell me how wonderful you did. I'm going to be spraying my throat again today, as always, so that I can talk. American poets, we're going to look at Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I found a great quote. If we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. And I see now that the word enough, E-N-O-U-G, needs an H. And somehow that got lost. I think it is true. If we knew the secret history of our enemies, some of our enemies in the world are great enemies. And if we knew the suffering and what they had been through, we might be a little more compassionate. We still cannot allow them to destroy America, but we can be more compassionate. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, 1807 to 1882. So you notice that this man lived through the Civil War. As an older gentleman, 1861 to 65, he lived through that Civil War. And that did cause him great grief. He would have been too old to fight, but he saw it happen. And he's about 20 years away from the automobile. And so he's living in a time before instant travel and before that. Civil War was a pretty vicious war. World War I, they're coming up with better guns and things like airplanes to help fight the war. And by the time we get to World War II, we have pretty modern warfare taking place. But back during the time of the Civil War, it was a pretty gruesome battle, brother against brother. In fact, speaking of brother against brother, you should ask your parents and your grandparents if they have any family stories to tell about the Civil War. I know that my grandfather had a story to share about 2 brothers with his same last name, not his brothers, but previous. My grandpa was born in 1904, and we need to get about to the 1860s for the Civil War, and they need to be 20 years old at that time. So the person needs to have been born in about 1840 or prior to fight in the Civil War in 1861. But you might have family stories of one brother fighting for the South and another fighting for the North, or what happened to the family. You should ask so that that history is not lost. Longfellow was a scholar and he was a poet. He was born in Maine to a lawyer. He turned from logic and law to romanticism, the study in human emotions as worldview, and then put down onto paper in words. The Puritans had struggled against emotions as a spiritual guide. You can guess that, can't you? William Bradford, Mary Rowlandson, Anne Bradstreet, Richard Baxter, they would not have followed their emotions. But with his emotions came beautiful words for Longfellow. Puritans did not want emotions to be a spiritual guide, instead leaning upon every Hebrew and Greek word in the good book. And I hope that that is where your worldview is centered. Every word in the good book, not necessarily every English word, but if you study up a little in Greek, Greek is very easy to learn. Hebrew is tougher. I will admit, Hebrew is a lot tougher. I have to practice a lot to keep up my Hebrew. Anyone can learn Greek. It's easier to learn than French or Spanish. You only have a few alphabet letters that don't line up with English alphabet letters. They're very easy to learn. But the Bible, based in its original languages, or a good English translation, is our good book. Longfellow's gifts and insights are considered to be American treasures. His insights into nature, his love of languages and history led him to a lifetime of research, travel, and writing of old world civilizations. He wrote about slavery and Native Americans. He wrote about mythology and legends, earning accolades from America and from the people in Europe. Hyperion is absolutely an amazing long poem. And so is Hiawatha. He experienced personal tragedy, the loss of a very young expectant wife. She actually died from a miscarriage, and the loss of another wife to fire. Can you imagine having your wife burn up in your home? And a son who ran away to fight in the Civil War against what his father wanted. The first poem we're going to share is from 101 Great American Poems. Your cover may not look like this. The Dover Company puts through different covers for their books all the time. Mine happens to be a very old cover, and it looks like this, 101 Great American Poems with no picture. But the one here on the slide was the current one the last time I was teaching, which was only last year. Page 6, The Arrow and the Song. I shot an arrow into the air. It fell to earth, I knew not where. For so swiftly it flew, the sight could not follow it in its flight. I breathed a song into the air. It fell to earth, I knew not where. For who has sight so keen and strong that it can follow the flight of song? Long, long afterward, in an oak, I found the arrow still unbroke, and the song from beginning to end, I found again in the heart of a friend. This is a short poem, The Arrow and the Song. I found this little piece of art. Perhaps you could do something better. I found this on the amazing internet, but I don't know who drew it. They did not sign this piece, and it was not labeled. But I suppose there are some of you who are quite artistic who might have a better artistic rendition. As a young man, he shot that arrow off, and you can tell that the man on the right in this picture, it's the same man, but he's a much older man. He finally found that arrow. It didn't go where he wanted it to go. But he found it later. And his song also came back to him in the heart of a friend. I suppose if you write a song and then you hear someone else singing it, it would be quite the compliment to find your song again. The Children's Hour. This is one of my favorite, one of my very favorite. Between the dark and the daylight, when the night is beginning to lower, comes a pause in the day's occupations that is known as the children's hour. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened, and voices soft and sweet. From my study, I see in the lamplight, descending the broad hall stair, grave Alice and laughing Allegra, and Edith with golden hair, his three daughters. A whisper and then a silence. Yet I know by their merry eyes they are plotting and planning together to take me by surprise. A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By three doors left unguarded, they enter my castle wall. They climb up into my turret, over the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere. They almost devour me with kisses, their arms about me entwine, till I think of the Bishop of Bingen in his mouse tower on the Rhine. Do you think, oh blue-eyed banditti, because you have scaled the wall, such an old mustache as I am is not a match for you all? I have you fast in my fortress and will not let you depart, but put you down into the dungeon in the round tower of my heart. And there will I keep you forever, yes, forever and a day, till the walls shall crumble to ruin and molder in dust away. Wasn't that a beautiful poem? So if we go back and you look at the title, it's The Children's Hour, Between the Dark and the Daylight. So it's bedtime, and the children are supposed to be up getting ready for bed, and they sneak down the stairs and they attack him in his tower, which would be his big chair, his three daughters, and jump on him, taking him, they think, by surprise, which of course is not surprised. And they come raiding from the hall, and they enter my castle wall. They get into his den and climb up over his turret, which is his big overstuffed chair, the back of his chair. They surround me. They seem to be everywhere, and they're not a match for him. He's going to keep them all in his heart forever. It's really beautiful imagery. This is one of my favorite poems. Now, our third poem is a longer poem. We've gone from very short to medium to long. Paul Revere's Ride, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. This is often published in a book form because it is so long, and then added with all types of pictures and things like that. And the meter and the rhyme of this poem is absolutely excellent. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said, good night, and with muffled oar, silently rowed to the Charleston shore. Just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar, across the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend through alley and street wanders and watches with eager ears, till in the silence around him he hears the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of feet, and the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed to the tower of the church, up the wooden stairs with stealthy tread, to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade by the trembling ladder steep and tall to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath in the churchyard lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went creeping along from tent to tent and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place and the hour and the secret dread of the lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all his thoughts are bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed on the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in a village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles in passing a spark, struck out by a steed that flies fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night, and the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steep, and behind him, beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt his edge, now soft on the sound and now on the ledge, is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and felt the damp of the river fog that rises when the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington. Remember Lexington and Concord? He saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. And one was safe and asleep in his bed, who at the bridge would be first to fall, who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball. You know the rest. In the books you have read how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For borne on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed at the midnight message of Paul Revere. Is that a great poem or what? And of course, factually, there are a few things that aren't completely true, but what an awesome, awesome poem, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. If you have been listening to me talk about Eric Metaxas, he has a YouTube video that I just looked at last night. He challenged a bunch of school children to memorize Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And he got so many video replies of children who had memorized the entire poem that he couldn't even listen to all of them because it was hundreds of children reading this. And so what he did was he put together a compilation of different children, some of them even dressed up, saying Paul Revere's Ride. So if you looked up on YouTube, Paul Revere's Ride, Eric Metaxas, you would find that compilation video. And it's really funny, from little children to families to big kids, but pretty awesome and kind of a pride of America type of poem. All right, we're out of poetry now, and we're back to a basic history of the United States. I have this set of history books, and they are amazing. Chapter 5, Volume 5, these are by Clarence Carson, and Volume 5 is called The Welfare State, 1929 to 1985. And this is what we have been talking about last week and this week. We're going to take a look at the Supreme Court and how it has changed in the last 150 years. How has the Supreme Court changed? What do you think? From Chapter 9, which says an activist Supreme Court. That's what the chapter is called. A second radical reconstruction from 1960 to 1975. The first reconstruction was right after the Civil War. The Civil War was 1861 to 1865. And when the South lost and the North won, the South had to be reconstructed. There was a period of reconstruction. And Clarence Carson is calling this period of 1960 to 1975, right after the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, God bless his soul, with his peaceful protests involving thousands and thousands of people and changing minds forever, that the color of your skin meant nothing. An amazing man. In fact, all of his papers, the FBI audios, the FBI spied on Martin Luther King, trying to prove he was something less than patriotic. Unfortunately, it did expose a little bit darker side of his character. Apparently, he really enjoyed women. And I hate to be the one to tell you that if you didn't know it. But we're not looking at the worst of a person. We're looking at the best of a person and what he did. And he had an idea to protest peacefully that changed things in America. And we call this a second radical reconstruction. Now, the chronology is, for example, 1954, there was a case to the Supreme Court, the Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka. And in this case, this is part of the Warren Court. Justice Warren was the Chief Justice of that court. And so it gets called the Warren Court. And this is when we began integrating schools. In 1955, there was a bus boycott in Montgomery, led by Martin Luther King. People with darker skin just quit riding the bus, and the buses didn't make any money. And it was a very peaceful protest, and it was very effective. 1957, President Eisenhower sent troops in to integrate Little Rock, Arkansas schools to force children with dark skin and kids with lighter skin to go to school together. 1963, mass Black demonstrations in Birmingham, Alabama. 1968, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. He was campaigning, and the murder of Martin Luther King. Two great men lost in a very important year. 1969, the United States lands a man on the moon. I was, 11, 57, 60, I was 11 or 12 when we landed on the moon. 1970, we're to the Kent State riots, where I believe either 7 or 9 college students were protesting, and police fired into their ranks and killed some of them. It's a huge, big deal. And it changed everything as far as what you can do on college. Police, I don't believe, would ever fire into rioters anymore. Not in the U.S. This is going on with women right now all across the world, willing to go to jail to not be forced to wear a hijab, however that word is pronounced. A 1971 adoption of the 26th Amendment. Oh, what's the 26th Amendment? Somebody tell me. If you know what it is, call it out now. We're going to look it up. Syllabus page 135. Syllabus page 135. What is the 26th Amendment? 1971. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age. So anybody 18 and over can now vote. These college kids, if they were old enough to be hoisted off to Vietnam to fight, then they're old enough to vote. All right, get out your copy of the Constitution, because we're going to be looking at the judicial branch of the United States of America. And we'll start out on page 124. Get out your copy of the Constitution, 124. And I showed you last week that I have my copy all marked up with color. This is page 124 in my copy. And you can see in blue, I have highlighted where it says Article 3, the judicial branch. This would be the Supreme Court. Section 1, the federal courts. The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and inferior courts, shall hold their offices during good behavior, and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. Okay, so here we have, this is what their authority is. If you have the Clarence Carson books, in volume 5, when he starts talking about judicial legislation, which I've used for this part of the PowerPoint. If you have the Clarence Carson set, volume 5, you would go to page 225. I've made a note here, page 225. It began in the courtroom of the majestic Supreme Court building in 1954. The Supreme Court was an odd place to spearhead the negative transformation of America. The powers of the court had always understood to be largely negative. Even the power to nullify acts of Congress and of state legislature was at best an implied power. The Constitution does not list such a power for the courts, although it had been understood by at least some of the founders that in the course of ruling upon cases, the courts might refuse to apply particular laws as being contrary to the Constitution. But so far as imposing changes were concerned, all legislative power authorized by the Constitution was vested in the Congress. The people who make laws is the House of Representatives and the Senate. Congress. If transformation was to come, then few would have conceived as recently as 1950 that the Supreme Court might be the instrument of it. Large-scale government changes were not expected or even hinted at yet. Eisenhower had recently been elected president. He served from 53 to 61. He was still making conservative noises, but appointed Earl Warren, a former governor of California, to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in 1953. And this is important. So because Earl Warren was the Chief Justice, it's called the Warren Court. Warren was a Republican, and there was little in his background to suggest that he would turn the court into an instrument for transforming America. 4 members were from the 1930s, way back in the 1930s. So the court was basically unchanged since the New Deal, shaped by Roosevelt. And of course, because you are young, what's Roosevelt's New Deal? We'll take a little sidestep here. Roosevelt's New Deal. These were reform programs from 1933 to 1936 that enacted reforms to relieve unemployment and prevent another depression. The Works program made the government the largest employer in the nation. Everybody got jobs. And of course, half of the people in America work for the government now also. You can't have really more than half or it's going to get awfully tipsy. The New Deal created the Housing Authority, the Farm Security Administration, and the Social Security Act. Now, the Social Security Act is kind of cool. You put 2% of your wages were into Social Security, whether you wanted to or not. As soon as you started working and started getting a paycheck, they would take 2% and send it to the government, and it would go into the Social Security Fund. 2%, that seemed like a great idea because that took care of all the grandmas and grandpas. People, if they didn't have savings account, if they survived through the Depression, and now we had a booming economy, and here we are in 1950, and who's going to take care of all the grandmas and grandpas? And the Social Security Act just seemed like the way to go to take care of people. Now, I do have to tell you, being a senior citizen, because I am 65 years old now, that many people have done the math and figured out that if my husband and I, if every cent that we earned from the time we turned 18 and started getting paychecks where they withheld Social Security tax from the age of 18 until now, age 65, if all of that money had gone into some type of a 401k, we would be millionaires. But we're not. We do have a 401k we put into, but we also pay into Social Security. And the current Social Security tax, your employer pays 6.2%, and you pay 6.2% for a total. And that was in 2021, last year. I taught this class last year, and I didn't look it up this year because of the whole COVID thing and they're reworking Social Security. So I don't know about 2022, and you can look it up if you're looking at this many years from now. And if you're self-employed, you have to pay all that and more. If you're self-employed, you have to pay 15.3%. 15.3%. That's more than most of you give to church. And you have to give that to Social Security. The idea back in the 50s with the Social Security Act was that we had so many people working and not too many retired folks. But now we have the baby boom. I think I'm a boomer. And we have all of these boomers, My husband and I just turned 65. We have a whole bunch of people turning 65, and now the Social Security is running dry, and they're not positive whether it will survive to 2034. They keep changing a year. You'll have to look it up. And you can go right to the Social Security Administration to get these same numbers, just as I did last year. But the problem is that there are not enough people working. And why are not enough people working for the number of older people? Because the young people are not having babies. Families used to have large families, and there were plenty of young people working to take care of those few elderly. Now, everybody's elderly and nobody had any kids. I don't know about your family. My family, my husband and I have 2 children. We miscarried. I miscarried 5 times. So we tried for the big family, but we only had 2. Now we do know homeschool families who are doing their fair share, having 6, 7, 8, 9 children or more. Where the biggest family I know has 10 homeschool family. But most families are not having enough children to keep that Social Security administration running properly. And our government has decided to tap into that fund to pay for other things. So now disability taps into that Social Security Administration, taking money away from the people who put that money away for their rainy day when they got old. You'll have to ask your mom and dad or your grandma and grandpa or your pastor what they think about that. Is that good or bad and right or wrong? Now, this was from, let's see, 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I went to the Social Security. So this is just before COVID. COVID-19, COVID was November 2019. So this is a year before that. All right, these are facts in 2018. And you can look up the new ones if you want. Nearly 9 out of 10 individuals age 65 and older receive Social Security benefits. Social Security benefits represent about 30%, 33% of the income of the elderly. So they also have another 60% coming from somewhere, their 401k or something like that. Retired workers and the dependents account for 72% of total benefits paid. Disabled workers and their dependents account for 13% of total benefits paid. 50% of the workforce in private industry has no private pension coverage. It used to be that you'd work for somewhere and they had a private pension that you would also get. Nobody provides pensions anymore, except government jobs. 36% of workers report that they and their spouses have not personally saved any money for retirement. In 1940, the life expectancy of a 65-year-old was almost 14 additional years. So in 1940, the average person lived to be 79. And actually, my mom was born in 33, and she did live to be 79 years old. Today, it is just over 20 years. So today, the average 65-year-old, like my husband and I, can expect to live 20 years to 75, 85 years old. Now, I kind of doubt that my husband and I will make it to 85. He has heart problems. I am a stage 4 cancer survivor. And so I have issues from that cancer. So I don't know that we'll make it 20 years, but a lot of people will. And if you're, I don't know, Dutch or Japanese, there are several nationalities that simply eat well, they have great genes, and they live a long time. My Dutch relatives are all living long life expectancies. And let's see, Japanese eat really well, so they have a longer life expectancy. Oh, and my Filipino relatives, I have relatives from all over the world. My Filipino relatives don't even show their age, and they live to be in their 80s at least. It's really amazing how some people live longer. But America, you know, these people didn't grow up eating Twinkies and Cinnamon Toast for breakfast. There are an estimated 175 million workers covered under Social Security. By 2035, that's the magic number. And it may, sometimes they say 2034, sometimes they say, well, I don't know if they go above 2035. The number of older Americans will increase from 49 million today to 79 million. In 2018, there were currently 2.8 workers for each Social Security beneficiary. By 2035, there will be 2.2 workers for each beneficiary. That means that even now, there are only 2 or 3 people working for every one older person who is collecting. And if the money had been put into the account and left there, there would be plenty of money, and it would be our money that we put there. But because the money has been tapped into and used for other things, we're trying to have people pay in now as we pay out. And that's not exactly fair, is it? To have 2 or 3 people working for every single person who's trying to collect and stay alive and buy groceries. Ask your mom, dad, your grandma, grandpa, your pastor what they think of that. I always like to say, ask your mom, dad, or pastor, because I think if we're going to have discussions at home, they might as well be worthwhile and lively. Back to Clarence Carson's History, Volume 5, Chapter 9. Warren might have been expected to restrain its reformist zeal, the Supreme Court. On the contrary, he took the lead in changing the role of the courts. The Supreme Court broke new ground most dramatically with its rulings in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, first announced in 1954. There were similar cases in South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. Plaintiffs acting for minor Black children had brought suits in these states in federal courts, seeking court orders to be admitted to white schools. These cases came to the Supreme Court on appeal, and the basic issue examined was whether or not racially segregated schools were in accord with the Constitution, specifically with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Now let's go to the 14th Amendment. This is in your syllabus, page 130. Let's go to that 14th Amendment. Turn to syllabus page 130. I'm almost there. And it's in the middle of the page. Now, Amendment 14, and this is 1868. What does that tell you? 1868, just 3 years after the Civil War. So the South lost, they're undergoing Reconstruction, and they are going down, dragging their heels and clawing the ground with their fingernails. They do not want they don't want people with dark skin to be on their baseball team. They don't want dark skinned people to be in their schools. They don't want to use the same library books. They don't want to use the same water fountain. They don't want to go to the same restaurant. They want to have the restaurant have partitions and things. They don't want to ride on the bus together. They have all types of things they're not going to do. And the 14th Amendment, 1868, reads, Section 1, all persons born or naturalized in the United States. That means whether your skin is light or dark, or even if you're a woman, or Irish or Chinese or any other oppressed minority, are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property. Underline that if you didn't underline it last week. Life, liberty, or property. You can't be denied life, liberty, or property without due process, circle that, mark it up somehow, of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, equal protection, this is very unique. And if you want, if you have your pen, you can write in the margin there in your syllabus on page 130, you can write, make a note, Jim Crow laws. We'll find out what those are in another few weeks, Jim Crow laws, and you can make a note that says separate but equal. Separate but equal. The South did not want dark-skinned people on the bus, in the restaurant, handling their school books, all of the other things they didn't want. But the 14th Amendment said everybody would have equal protection. And so what the South did was they decided they could do separate but equal. So they still wanted to have segregation. They wanted dark-skinned people to be in one school and fair-skinned people to be in another. And you throw in there Irish, Chinese, anybody who doesn't look like a light-skinned person is going to go in the other dumpy pile. separate but equal. And the South said, oh, we're abiding by the 14th Amendment because we are providing equal protection. It's just separate but equal. And you only have to ask somebody from the South who grew up in the 1950s whether things really were separate but also equal, because that went on for close to 100 years. All right, continuing, it's called the equal protection. Equal protection, and that's in the last, underline it in red, circle it, or whatever you have to do. The equal protection clause of that 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Get your pen out if you didn't do it 5 minutes ago. And of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of, underline it, highlight it, life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process is a big deal too. Nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Make sure you can find this section and make sure you know what the 14th Amendment addresses. Make sure you know the time period right after the Civil War, during the Southern Reconstruction. The Southerners do not want to share their tables and libraries and ball fields and schools with dark-skinned people. The Supreme Court ruled that they were contrary to the Constitution. Therefore, courts had ruled on a number of occasions that states could maintain separate facilities for those of different races, so long as they were equal. Remember, separate but equal. Chief Justice Warren, speaking for a unanimous court, so they all agreed. It wasn't 6-3 or 5-4. A unanimous court held that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. And that, okay, so Chief Justice Warren, he looked at that and he said, no, separate schools, that's inherently unequal. Just that they're different schools, that's inherently unequal. You can't divide people by skin color. You just can't do it. And that the segregation complained of deprived plaintiffs of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. By May 1955, the court ordered that since racial discrimination in public education is unconstitutional, all provisions of federal, state, or local law requiring or permitting such discrimination must yield to this principle. The courts will require a prompt and reasonable start toward full compliance and enter such orders and decrees as are necessary and proper to admit to public schools on a socially non-discriminating basis with all deliberate speed the parties to these cases. The Supreme Court's decision aroused legal controversy. The implications were felt for 10 years and raised questions about the power of the court. The national media, coming into every American home now during the mid-1950s, my grandpa had one of the first televisions in 1957 when I was born. Pretty much most homes had televisions. They were little, 10-inch black and white televisions that weighed, 100 pounds, but television was coming into every home. The national media generally proclaimed the court's pronouncements were the law of the land and should be obeyed. Now, the only problem, of course, this is good. This is right. This is just. This is justice. It was justice. Should they have waited for the House of Representatives and the Senate, the legislatures, should they have waited for them to create good laws rather than just create laws themselves? Well, legally, yes. Legally, yes. They should have said that this is illegal, and the president should have stomped around his feet, but we didn't have that kind of president, and said, I demand laws prepared now. I want laws written now so that segregation is illegal. But because it was a good thing, or for the North anyway, this was a good thing, the law of the land, the law of SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, had to be obeyed. It took years to enforce. Compliance did not happen overnight, and the media sensationalized the progression of the case. And that's because it wasn't by law, it was by fiat. The Supreme Court of the United States just said, this is the law. That's not constitutional. You can't do that anymore. You can't segregate kids. Imagine being your age in the 1950s and having to go to a lesser quality school because you have dark skin. Now, I don't know how many of you are racially diverse in your family. We have people in our family from all walks of life, all walks of life. We have Chinese, Korean, we have lots of Filipino, we have Scottish, we have Black, we have Native American, Indian, we have everything in our family. Imagine somebody telling your family that some of your cousins who don't look white-skinned enough can't go to the good school. Imagine having dark skin and you can't go to the good school. You can't go to the school that has the newer books, the better science equipment, the better teachers. You can't go because of the color of your skin. And that is what had been happening. The most serious charges against the Supreme Court was that it had usurped the power of the legislative branch by legislating. And they did, didn't they? In fact, the court did not exactly legislate. It only issued orders as if it had legislated by announcing its opinion that segregated schools were unconstitutional. Thus, in effect, the court, the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS, they had legislated. Now, we have a balance of powers we talked about last week. The Supreme Court is not supposed to legislate. The legislature is supposed to legislate. If the court had gone no further than to declare that segregation laws were unconstitutional and that they could not be enforced in the courts, it would have been performing an accepted judicial function. It would have left the legislation to the states. But the problem is, just like slavery, if you left the legislation to the states, would Alabama, Louisiana, would they legislate? Would they do the morally correct thing? I don't think so. It would have nullified the laws which required segregation. The court was designed to nullify those laws that did not comply with the Constitution. The court was not designed to create or enforce the law. Creation of law is left to the legislative branch of government. Legislation was to be made through legislators who were voted in by the people to represent them. In this way, 9 supreme rulers could not create law against the will of the people, the voters. Just think about it. Excuse me. Just think about it. Should 9 unelected Americans be able to create law? No. What do you do when many of the states are practicing segregation? Obviously, illegal and unconstitutional and just morally wrong. But what do you do? And the Supreme Court legislated. And that is when the balance of power became unbalanced. The stakes are high as the country is still digesting one of the most historic terms in recent history, which included blockbuster cases on Obamacare and abortion. The last few years have been incredible with cases, very unusual cases. This picture is from the Trump administration, and following pictures, I have included our newest Supreme Court member. What we see today in regards to abortion and gay marriage decisions made by the court against the vote of the people is directly resultant from Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, it's hard to think of that as being a bad thing. It's hard to look at Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka and say that that was wrong, because it overthrew segregation, which was wrong. But because the court legislated, the court took that power, no one challenged them, and they now take that power. This is Chief Justice John Roberts. So this court will probably go down in history as John Roberts Court, just like Earl Warren's court. And he is here with Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, our newest Supreme Court Justice. And this is before a ceremonial swearing in the East Room. And this is recent from September 30 of this year. So just a few weeks ago for me. The Supreme Court compelled integration in state after state, at first on the basis of particular cases, and then more broadly in the absence of any law except its decree. If there is no law and they need to make a law, they made laws. But was it right? And was it good or healthy for America? And this is interesting, where you see that one person's sin, that the sin of people who wanted to be segregated, changed our system and unbalanced our system for many, many, many years. We'll see if anything can be done to take us back to a more correct balance of powers. I'm not sure. We'll see what you look into and you tell me. Many states immediately integrated. Here in Oregon, it really wasn't such a big deal. I don't remember any issues of any kind of integration to begin with. There were very few Black people in Oregon when I was growing up. I was born here in 1957, and I didn't really meet very many Black people until, well, I have a Black cousin, and so I have a Black family member, and then many of the people that I went to church with were Black. But in school, we've only had a few Black people in my school. We had lots of Vietnamese students because it was post-Vietnam War and Vietnamese were coming to America, and the situation was that they were a lot smarter than we were. I think they had come from a very poor education system, and they came to America and saw everything that they could do with their education, and they all put us to shame in the way that they worked and excelled and exceeded. It got to the point that in the 1970s, the late 1970s, people were looking for Vietnamese people to hire because they knew that they did so well in school and worked so hard, and were just hard workers. My Filipino relatives are the same way. I hate to start labeling people, but they, coming from the Philippines, where very little is fair. Even your mail is not fair. Your mail may come open in packages, opened with things removed and taped back together. But my Filipino relatives work harder than anybody that I know, because they are so glad to be here, where hard work equals success, and they work very, very hard, and they are excellent. They have several care homes where they take care of the elderly, and it's an incredible blessing here in America to have your elderly person, your elderly relative taken care of by these Filipinos, because they also have a different worldview toward the elderly. They look at the elderly that you must treat them not just with compassion and care, but that you owe them respect. Even if they have dementia or Alzheimer's, you still must treat them with the utmost of respect. And so you can imagine how successful they have been here, because Americans aren't like that. We don't treat people with dementia and Alzheimer's. We don't always treat them with respect. Anyway, I'm off on a rabbit trail there. So the Supreme Court made everybody integrate, state after state. And here in Oregon, I don't think it was a big deal. But in the southern states, it was a big deal. All of these terrible photos that are shocking, like this one on slide 49, these horrible pictures of the National Guard not wanting to let these kids, look at these kids that just want to go to school. And look how well dressed people used to go to school. They kind of put us to shame. And these kids, they just want to go study science and history and engineering. They want to be doctors and lawyers and make something of themselves and get up from the poverty that they've been placed in. But they made law because there was no law. Many states immediately integrated. Southern states fought tooth and nail, admitting and then expelling students. The governor of Arkansas called in the National Guard to prevent Black students' entry to a high school in Little Rock. Amazing. Call in soldiers to not let people with dark skin. Faced with a federal court injunction, the governor removed the troops. As the African-American children tried to comply and enter the school, a riot broke out. President Eisenhower sent in paratroopers, and the integration forcefully took place. Look at this young man, in slide 50, dressed better than any of you, I would guess. He's dressed well. He's wearing slacks. He's not in jeans or sweatpants. He's wearing slacks with a belt and a woven shirt with a collar, with a trim haircut. All he wants to do is go to school. He just wants to go to school. Who knows what he wants to be? I would love to know his name and know, did he become a scientist? Did he become a doctor? Did he become a lawyer? Did he become a civil rights lawyer? What did he do with his life? It was well into the 1960s before most of the states in the Deep South got full-scale integration. My father-in-law was from Alabama, and my mother-in-law visited Alabama twice. And after the second time, she said she would never go back to Alabama. She didn't like the way they treated dark-skinned people, and she didn't like the way they treated women, because women and people with dark skin were second-class citizens. And that was in the 1960s. So if you're from Oregon or the Northwest like I am, it's hard for us to understand what this was like. I want you to imagine what it's like for this young man who just wants to go to school. Even President Kennedy was forced to send troops when rioting broke out at the University of Mississippi. Resistance was over by 1963. Whether the compulsory integration was judicial legislation, which would be officially an oxymoron by the Constitution because judges can't legislate, whether the compulsory integration was judicial legislation or by a strange use of court orders may remain in doubt. The Warren Court, as it was coming to be called, was striking out in other directions by the 1960s. And you must remember the Warren Court and what it was about, and the Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka. You must know these things. Many of the new decisions were aimed at taking away states' rights. Election districts were not being shifted to fit populations as was intended because state legislatures didn't get around to it. Remember, more people, you get more House of Representatives. Every state gets 2 senators, but the House of Representatives goes by the number of people in your district. And if the number of people goes up, you need to get another legislator. The Supreme Court had never claimed jurisdiction in any dispute over such election districts. The Constitution delegates no power to any branch of the federal government to superintend the drawing of lines for election districts for state legislatures. In the absence of the grant of any such power, the 10th Amendment would not allow federal intervention. I apologize that it says no and not. Your syllabus, page 128. Let's look at the 10th Amendment. Syllabus, page 128. What's the 10th Amendment? Now let's take a look. In 1791, remember those first 10 amendments are the Bill of Rights. So this is the last of the Bill of Rights. And 1791, the powers, and you better mark this one because you have to know this. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. All right, this is 1791. If the item is not addressed in the Constitution, how do we decide? State by state, state by state, except integration. This 10th Amendment, that's what the Southern states used as their antebellum war cry. They said, you can't say that. The Constitution says we can decide state by state, and we decide for slavery. And we decided it was worth fighting a war. At that time, I mentioned at the beginning of class, there were about 700,000 slaves in 1790, 18% of our population, all of them in the South. Kids, men, women, families separated. If you have any stories of slavery from your family, I would love it if you would share those stories with me. If any of your relatives who owned slaves or were slaves wrote narratives, I'd be very interested in those narratives. Why did the founding fathers put the 10th Amendment into the Bill of Rights? The explanation is that they did not want the central government to become too powerful. They did not want a government that was located far away from their homes, dictating how they lived their daily lives. They wanted as much power as possible to be retained in their local state legislatures. All right, the 10th Amendment, 1791, you've got it marked up on your copy. That's what the Southern states used for their pre-Civil War rally cry. The South seceded from the central government that they felt had failed to honor the covenant, the constitutional amendment that had bound the states together. With Lincoln's election, first South Carolina, then Georgia, then Florida, then Alabama, then Mississippi, etc., became the Confederate States of America, and they declared Jefferson Davis to be their president. And you can see this little political cartoon. Go it, Carolina. We are the boys to wreck the Union. The biggest complaint was that the court had overstepped its boundaries as laid out in the Constitution. The court had wrested power assigned to the legislative branch, redrawing boundaries, and usurped power from the states when it began judicial legislation. Again, an oxymoron. In his farewell address, remember, in his farewell address in 1796, George Washington made a point, which is the central concern here. He said, if in the opinion of the people, the distribution or modification of the constitutional powers be in any way particular wrong, let it be corrected by an amendment in the way which the Constitution designates, but let there be no change by usurpation. So let there be an amendment, but don't let somebody usurp the authority. And we let the Supreme Court usurp their authority because the cause was good, because the time was right. For though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, yes, Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, in that one instance, of course that was good. For though this in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. If you allow that balance of power to be taken out of balance, if you allow the Supreme Court to start legislating, this is how free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any transient or partial benefit which the use at the time can yield. The tendency in the Warren Court was to break down the established authority within the United States, even as the High Court was increasing its own power by claiming constitutionality for its every utterance. It was not only undermining the authority of other branches of government, but ultimately the foundation of its own authority. The most direct assault was on the authority of state and local governments, on their legislatures. It was saying, in effect, if there is a wrong to be corrected, it is not necessary to persuade people in local areas and states that it needs correcting and then electing officials who are committed to doing it and making all the laws. All that is necessary to do to get it corrected is to go into the federal courts and seek relief. And that's what people do now. The members of our Supreme Court are appointed by the president. They are not elected. A president who gets to appoint justices wields a great power. Our Supreme Court now rules as an oligarchy, the rule of 9 unelected men and women. And of course, when Carson wrote this, I suppose they were all men. I'm quoting Carson here. This means there has been a tremendous increase of court cases because that's what you do. You don't legislate, you take it to court and you battle it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And this has been wonderful if you want to be a lawyer. And this has made all the lawyers rich because you don't change the laws, you let the court decide. The Supreme Court accepts only 70 cases per year. All right, here is the SCOTUS, which should have little dots there because it is an acronym. Supreme Court of the United States is what SCOTUS stands for. As of October 2022, I am making this on October 19, 2022. Front row, left to right, Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor, Clarence Thomas, God bless him, I hope he lives a long time. Chief Justice John Roberts, Associate Justice Samuel Alito. Samuel Alito is the one who wrote the, he's the second, he's in the front row, the second from the right. He's the one who wrote the Roe versus Wade recall, 230-page paper that we'll talk about in a minute here. and Associate Justice Elena Kagan. And the back row is Amy Coney Barrett, who is rather new, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, who's rather new, and then brand new is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson for their portrait. And of course, missing is Ruth Ginsburg, who passed away earlier this year. The number of lawyers, what do you expect, has increased exponentially through the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. In essence, the Warren Court undermined governmental authority. Amazing. And because it was for a good cause, because segregation was morally wrong, but not taking it through the right channels has left us with an unbalance of our powers. Next, we're going to have some fun. The case of the unconstitutional candy canes. On January 22, 1973, the US Supreme Court struck down a Texas statute banning abortion. I think my slides are out of order. The candy cane comes along later. It'll just have to be this way. So this is Roe versus Wade, that landmark legal decision. And this is amazing. This is a slide. This photo is from the 1970s after Roe versus Wade was codified, was made law. And you can see love, life. I'm glad you were born. Everyone should have a birthday. January 22, 1973, the blackest day in US history. Think twice about life. People could not believe that abortion was made legal. And now it's been here for 49 years and people can't believe that it is going to be unlegal. But it's state by state. So people say, oh no, there won't be any more abortions. It's going to be state by state as the Constitution said it should be. So US Supreme Court struck down a Texas statute that banned abortion, effectively legalizing the procedure of abortion across the United States because it was the Supreme Court. The court held that a woman's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy protected by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Okay, let's look at that 14th Amendment in section 1. The 14th Amendment is on page 130. 14th Amendment is on page 130. Back to page 130. Remember, I'm going to read the bottom half of it. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process. You have these all circled or marked up now. Without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, do you see anything about the right to privacy being protected in the 14th Amendment? Take a look at the 14th Amendment. Do you see anything about the right to privacy? The court had held that a woman's right to an abortion was implicit in the right to privacy protected by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. The wording of the 14th Amendment has emerged as a cornerstone of key civil rights cases that have shaped America. The myriad ways that jurists, in other words, lawyers, have interpreted it means that the 14th Amendment has also become legally tested more than any other part of the Constitution. If you simply add in the right to privacy, then you can overturn all types of laws. I see you can't deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. But I do not see anything here about privacy. This slide is Norma McCorvey. She was the Jane Roe. They were protecting her name. She was Jane Roe in the Roe versus Wade. Her real name was Norma McCorvey. And this quote from her, she became a Christian later. She's wearing her cross. I think it's safe to say that the entire abortion industry is based on a lie. I am dedicated to spending the rest of my life undoing a law that bears my name. That's a powerful quote. When you think of all the children who have not been born, and when you think of where Planned Parenthood places its clinics, where are abortion clinics placed? In poverty, areas of great poverty, and areas where people are not Caucasian, areas where people have darker skin. That's where Planned Parenthood puts their abortion clinics. Planned Parenthood, if you look back to its roots, that'd be a great senior project, would be to explore Planned Parenthood and their founder and their founder's purpose, which of course was to wipe out all of the dark-skinned people as possible so that they wouldn't have babies, and get rid of all the dark-skinned people. Their purpose of Planned Parenthood is absolutely horrific. You could look into Planned Parenthood and have quite a project if you can stomach that. But the 14th Amendment has been legally tested more than any other part of the Constitution. That's why you, as a good American citizen, studying American literature and the Constitution. We only have a few weeks to look at the Constitution, and then we have to move forward. So pay attention and do it well. It is the 14th Amendment that created the theory of substantive due process, a concept that reinforces many liberties that Americans take for granted today. Technical due process is a relatively direct directive, and you could write in the margin of the 14th Amendment in your copy on page 130 in the syllabus, you could write in theory of substantive due process. Technical due process is a relatively direct directive. Did a government entity follow the law when it deprived someone of their life, liberty, or property? You must prove in court that an infringement on someone's rights is justified and necessary for their life, liberty, and property. In 1961, birth control was illegal in Connecticut in Griswold versus Connecticut, which was presented in 1965. These are the things that are leading up to Roe versus Wade. Activist Estelle Griswold, you need to remember her name, sought to overturn state laws from 1879, which criminalized use of contraceptives. Yes, using contraceptives was illegal. The case used the due process that was determined to be in the 14th Amendment. You and I don't see it in there, but if you haven't written it in the margin yet, you need to write in due process and put it in quotation marks in the margin by the 14th Amendment. Due process determined to be in the 14th Amendment to claim women were denied liberty. Remember, you have the right to life, liberty, or property. You're denying her liberty. To claim women were denied liberty, the right of married couples to make private decisions about contraception. Another use of the 14th Amendment took place in 1958. The case wasn't actually presented to the Supreme Court until 1967, concerning the right to marry whomever you wanted. This poor couple, you can tell he's light-skinned, she's dark-skinned. This is Richard and Mildred Loving, and all they want is to be married. But this is concerning the right to marry whomever you want. The Lovings were arrested after their marriage and thrown out of Virginia and told to stay out for 25 years or they'd be jailed again. They'd be incarcerated again. Chief Justice Earl Warren declared the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race, and that word of race is Earl Warren's word. I do not use the word race because there is only one race, and that is the human race. People have different shades of skin, but we are only one race. But he says a person of another race, which would be another skin color, resides with the individual and cannot be infringed by the state. So if persons can decide who to marry and whether to use contraceptives, can they choose to have an abortion? You can see these are deep topics. That's why I keep telling you, ask your parents, ask your grandparents, ask your pastor, and see what they think. Of course, people should not be denied marrying somebody just because their skin is a different color. In 1973, Norma McCovey, the Jane the Jane Roe, was pregnant with her third child. Her first two children had been taken away. She wasn't a Christian yet. Her first two children had been taken away and she wanted an abortion, but she was refused because Texas law forbid abortion unless the mother's life was endangered. Norma's lawyer, who aided her in adopting, because she couldn't get an abortion, of course, by the time this went to court, the baby was born and a toddler and half grown up by then. But Norma's lawyer got her, helped her to adopt her child out and introduced her to lawyers who could argue her right to abortion. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The privacy clause presumed in the prior cases, especially Griswold, was the key to making the decision. So now on your 14th Amendment, syllabus page 130, you wrote in due process, and now I want you to write in privacy in quotations, because that word privacy is thought to be implicit in the 14th Amendment, which would be life, liberty, or property. The liberty part is where they say it also means privacy, that it is implicit. And that was the key to making the decision, was invoking that privacy. And you see how each of these cases is built on a previous case. In June, I think June 24 of this year, 2022, 49 years later, the Supreme Court reversed their decision, voting 5-4 to overturn Roe. The decision is about 213 pages long, and it is worth reading. I know it's long. It is worth reading. Your family should be reading this. They decided that the 14th Amendment does not protect a right to abortion. And here you have lawyers arguing. Roe versus Wade is going into the trash can, June 24, 2022, with lawyers saying it's a woman's right, and someone else saying it's judicial precedent. It's based on other cases, which it is. And now those other cases that were all based on these suppositions of the 14th Amendment, that's why they're all coming into question now. States are going to have to decide because the court should not have. So there are other decisions that may be reversed. And Justice Clarence Thomas, the wise one, the best brain on the court, says it's trash. Roe versus Wade is trash. I love that. Okay, the candy cane case. This was my slide out of order. The Supreme Court refused on Monday to hear oral arguments surrounding a 2003 case in which a Texas school stopped allegedly deprived students of their freedom or of religious expression, known as the candy cane case. The Supreme Court opted to not hear arguments from Morgan versus Swanson, which surrounded issues of student religious expression at schools in the Plano Independent School District. This is a case from 2012, talking about a case that started out in 2003 when a little boy, it was first presented in the Oregonian, and I'm in Oregon, and this is where I heard about it, October 20th, 2004. Now you can tell this kid is all grown up. By the time it makes it to the court, he's not in kindergarten anymore. But at that time, Jonathan Morgan, a Gresham Barlow student, kindergarten student, had his First Amendment rights violated when he was not allowed to distribute these candy canes to his schoolmates. And I do see another typo there. I apologize for that. Let's look at that First Amendment. Remember, it's the first in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and this is in your syllabus, page 127. And what is the First Amendment? Remember, they're the 5 freedoms: the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition, all of these things. And this is, the whole idea is that the First Amendment addresses that a government should not restrict opinions, merely uphold justice. They're not to restrict opinions. And that, of course, is what's wrong with big tech today. That's a problem of your generation. Okay, they wouldn't let him pass out the candy canes at school because it had a little story attached to it. It began in 2003 when school officials from his school stopped kindergarten students from distributing candy canes that had this little religious message attached to them. In that same time, a class was not allowed to write Merry Christmas on cards that would be sent to soldiers serving abroad. We have had this incredible push to secularize America. This is, you can get these at any Christian outlet. Look at the candy cane. What do you see? Stripes that are red like the blood shed for me. White is for my Savior who's sinless and pure. J is for Jesus, my Lord, that's for sure. Turn it around and a staff you will see. Jesus, my shepherd, was born for me. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. Isn't this just great? More commonly known as the candy cane case, it was brought to the courts when several Plano parents sued the school district. Your kid brings that home and you sue them. Plano changed its policy on student expression because we don't want to offend anybody. So we change it all when one person complains to allow for the passing out of religious materials at certain times and places. They will not allow that now. In 2009, when he's 6 years older, so now he's about 12, a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that the new policy was constitutional, but it also ruled that the officials who first barred the students from certain religious expressions in 2003 were liable for violating speech rights. According to which amendment? Yes, the First Amendment. The lawyer representing Jonathan stated, as long as the expression is not obscene or otherwise disruptive, students are free to distribute materials, including religious materials, during non-curricular times. What are Jonathan's First Amendment rights? Okay, you've got your syllabus open. You're at syllabus page 127. The case was thrown out in 2012 when the SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, declined to hear the case in 2012. They just said, wow, we don't have time for this, and it was thrown out. All right, let's look at another one. This is a pro-lifer being charged for fetus display. This is not a fetus on slide 76. This is a model of a fetus, an unborn child. Fetus is a Latin word that means unborn child. An activist who had a dead fetus in a jar in an anti-abortion rally is facing charges for keeping and exposing a dead body or a body part. Did you know that it's illegal to, you can't put your dead grandma in a wagon and drive her around town? They'll be put in jail. You can't photograph your dead grandma and put pictures of her all over social media. If you have an abortion, you can't take the baby around and, well, I don't want to use the word abortion. If your child dies, if your baby dies, you can't carry them around and show them to people. You just can't do that. We have laws that protect the integrity of a body. Once someone is deceased, you are not supposed to take pictures. That's why police, even at crime scenes, carry tarps so that if someone is deceased, they are covered up to protect the integrity of that. That's someone's loved one, somebody's dad, grandpa, brother, or husband. And the idea is that we don't, because everybody has a camera now, we don't want pictures of dead people. It's just wrong. And most newsreels that show things, if they happen upon a dead person, they actually mute it out with a soft haze effect so that you can't see who that is. If they want to show, for example, the rest of the body, they have to cover the face so that no one can say, oh my goodness, there's Uncle Jerry, that kind of thing. So an activist who had a dead fetus in a jar, is a fetus a person? Had a fetus in a jar at an anti-abortion rally is facing charges for keeping and exposing a dead body or body part. Although the defense has not yet raised the issue in the trial, the charge underscores the contradictions in US law over the legal standing of a fetus. White was arrested last spring while demonstrating outside a Planned Parenthood clinic in the nation's capital, the Washington Post reported. When police officers asked White what he had in his pocket, he pulled out a jar with a 15 to 17-week-old female fetus set in clear liquid. The officers made phone calls to commanders and prosecutors to determine what law White might have broken. Has he broken a law? Can we arrest this guy? The Post said. They finally arrested him and charged him with keeping and exposing a dead body or a body part. Now you see where this is going, don't you? Perhaps if you've studied logic, especially, you see where this is going. Chavez Ochoa pointed out in an interview with the Post that abortion rights activists argue a fetus is merely a cluster of cells, not a human being. Well, this is a fetus, but you say a fetus isn't a person. You say a fetus is just a clump of cells, not a human being. This is a fetus. So I'm not displaying a dead body, I'm displaying a fetus, a clump of cells. If that argument is correct, he said, then how can somebody be charged by the District of Columbia with displaying a human being when it was a fetus? It's a contradictory argument, Chavez Ochoa said. If it's not just a clump of cells, Is the Attorney General willing to concede that a fetus is in fact a human being? Okay, and this is something fun. We're almost done. This is something fun from the Oregonian. Sometimes I call it the Pornogonian because of the things that they publish. This is from way back, a letter to the editor of the Oregonian, back when we all got newspapers delivered to our homes. We didn't read the news on our iPads like we do now. We got newspapers at home, and then we used those newspapers to start fires or keep weeds out of our garden and things like that. But we all got newspapers, or many of us, delivered to our doors. So this is February 9, 2002. And this is a letter to the editor, and it got published. It's sad how your February 2 editorial, Prenatal Care, Not Fetal Rights, played word games when referring to unborn children as fetuses, avoiding the fact that they are unborn children. Fetus is a Latin word meaning young offspring, little one, not blobs of tissue. Fetus does not mean blobs of tissue. It means young offspring or little one. That's lost with abortionists who live constantly lying to themselves that the little ones in mothers' wombs are disposable. I've saved that all these years. No one shares pictures of ultrasounds with friends and family saying, "This is our fetus." The news media didn't announce that kidnapped Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl's wife is carrying their first fetus. We all know it's a baby. A baby is only called a fetus when a woman chooses death for her child, turning what should be a sanctuary, the womb, into a tomb. If the fetus is not human in the law's eyes, what is it? Is it a blob of tissue, part of the mother's body? No, it has a different blood type, it has different DNA. Is it property? Remember the Fifth Amendment, syllabus page 128, property. Is it property? Is it your property? Is that unborn child property? And I like this illustration from the Civil War era. This guy with dark skin, and he says, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And he is enslaved. He's saying, "I'm your brother. I'm a man. I just have dark skin. You have light skin." Remember, okay, something to think about, something to talk about with family. Your Constitution paper about a historical building or a historical person or a historical event concerning the Constitution, a historical timeline, or an alternate artistic option, and that's only if it's proved by a parent or teacher, is due next session. Okay, the Lord bless you. It was a great class. I enjoyed talking to you.